3 people were dead, a mother and her 2 daughters. And before investigators could find the person they wanted to question, he was already thousands of kilometers away. He had left the United Kingdom. He traveled through an international airport and eventually he arrived in South Africa. But South Africa would not be the safe haven he may have hoped for, because within days an international manhunt would lead investigators to Johannesburg, and when the police finally found him, they allegedly discovered something that would create an entirely new criminal case: a firearm, a 9mm pistol, and suddenly the man wanted in Britain in connection with 3 deaths was sitting inside a South African courtroom. But there is something even more disturbing about this story. The 3 people who died were not strangers. They were his own family, his wife, and his 2 daughters. So how did a family tragedy in Bedfordshire turn into an international manhunt that ended in Kensington, Johannesburg? And how did South African police manage to find a man who had crossed international borders in just a matter of days? This is a story of Ndodana Tshuma. The story begins in Great Denham, near Bedford, England. It is the kind of a place that one can appear almost ordinary. Residential streets, family homes, neighbors who know each other, and behind one of those doors, a family had built a life. Notable Ndodana Tshuma, known as Zandile, was 42 years old. Her daughters were Natalie, 15 years, and Nala, just 5 years old. They were mother and daughters. And according to tributes from their family, they were deeply loved. Natalie was remembered as intelligent, gentle, someone with great promise. Nala was described as a joyful young child. And Zandile was remembered as someone who had built a life and career in the United Kingdom. Then, something changed. The family stopped being seen, and concern began to grow. Police were eventually called to the property. What they found would transform the case. The 3 family members were dead. Police launched a murder investigation. The victims were identified as 42-year-old notable Zandile Tshuma, 15-year-old Natalie, and a 5-year-old Nala. Forensic post-mortem examinations later determined that the 3 died from a blunt force trauma, and investigators now had 3 victims, 1 home, and a rapidly developing murder investigation. But there was one problem. The man police wanted to find was not there. 45 at the initial reporting was Zandile's husband and the girl's father. And according to investigators, he had already left Britain. This is where the story crosses borders. According to British police, Tshuma left the United Kingdom on 4 July 2026. He traveled from Heathrow Airport. Reports indicate that his journey took him through Dubai before he reached Johannesburg, South Africa. By 5 July, he had arrived in South Africa. Think about the timing. Back in Britain, a family was about to become the center of a triple murder investigation, but the man the police were looking for was already moving across international borders. He had gone from Britain to the African continent, and he was now in Johannesburg. For investigators, the clock was ticking. This was no longer just a murder investigation. British investigators were now dealing with a suspect who had crossed international borders. Bedfordshire police worked with UK National Crime Agency, Interpol, Zimbabwean authorities, and the South African law enforcement. The investigation moved quickly. British prosecutors reviewed the evidence presented by investigators, and on 10 July, the Crown Prosecution Service authorized 3 murder charges against Tshuma, 1 for Zandile, 1 for Natalie, and 1 for Nala. But there was still a problem. The suspect was in South Africa, and the British authorities could not simply fly into Johannesburg and take him back. They needed South African authorities. They needed an international legal process, and they needed to find him first. An international alert was issued, and according to South African reporting, Tshuma was placed on an Interpol red notice. The request reached the South African authorities. SAPS Interpol National Central Bureau in Pretoria became involved, along with Crime Intelligence and the Gauteng Organized Crime Investigation Unit. Now, the hunt had reached Johannesburg, but investigators needed to locate him. And then, someone provided information that would change everything. According to reports, South African authorities received a tip that assisted them locate Tshuma. The information was reportedly believed to have come from someone connected to the family, and the search narrowed. The target was no longer somewhere in South Africa. He was in Johannesburg, more specifically Kensington. Within days of arriving in the country, the international fugitive had been located, and then South African police moved in. On 10 July 2026, SAPS arrested Ndodana Tshuma in Kensington, Johannesburg. The operation involved South African authorities and Interpol, and the arrest marked a dramatic turning point. A man wanted in connection with 3 alleged murders in Britain was now in South African custody, but investigators allegedly found something else: a weapon, an unlicensed 9mm firearm and ammunition, and that created a second criminal case. The firearm allegation is important because it is a South African criminal matter, separate from the British murder allegations. Police alleged that the firearm had been obtained in Gauteng. Some reporting identified Alexandra as the alleged place where the weapon was bought. South African police also said they were investigating how Tshuma obtained the unlicensed weapon and who supplied it. There were also reports that South African police suspected the firearm may have been intended for Tshuma to take his own life, but that remains an allegation from the investigation, not an established fact. And this distinction matters because there are now 2 different legal questions. 1. What happened to Zandile, Natalie and Nala in Britain? And 2. Did Tshuma unlawfully possess the firearm and ammunition found in South Africa? The South African court can deal with the local firearm allegation, but the murder allegations belongs to the British legal system, and that's where the extradition enters the story. If you are enjoying this investigation, subscribe to Hit Drops because what happens next gets even more complicated. South African police had found him, but Britain still wanted him back. And that's where the extradition battle begins. On 13 July, Tshuma appeared before the Johannesburg Magistrates Court, but he was not standing trial for the 3 British murders. Not yet. The local case concerned the alleged unlawful possession of a firearm and ammunition. At the same time, separate extradition proceedings were beginning. And that created a fascinating legal situation. The British murder investigation was now being played out across 2 legal systems. Britain wanted Tshuma back, South Africa had him in custody, and the South African courts had to deal with the legal process that could eventually allow him to be returned. At his later appearance on 22 July, Tshuma abandoned his bail application in the South African firearm matter. That meant he would remain in custody. The court postponed both the firearm case and the extradition proceedings to 27 August 2026. The extradition proceedings were delayed while documentation from the United Kingdom was being finalized. The firearm matter was postponed for further investigations and ballistic work. So as of now, Tshuma remains behind bars in South Africa, and the next major legal chapter is scheduled for 27 August. But extradition is not simply Britain wants him back, so South Africa sends him back. There is a legal process. The South African courts must consider whether the requirements for extraditions have been met, and the relevant documentations must be provided. According to the National Prosecuting Authority, the extradition proceedings were postponed to allow the documentation to be finalized. There is another application. Tshuma entered South Africa legally through OR Tambo International Airport on 5 July, but according to the NPA, his immigration status subsequently changed because of his fugitive status. He He was then regarded as a prohibited and undesirable person and considered unlawfully present in South Africa. So the man who legally walked through an airport was now sitting in custody, waiting to learn whether South Africa would eventually send him back to Britain. And this brings us back to the question at the center of everything. What happened to Zandile, Natali, and Nala? British prosecutors have authorized 3 murder charges, but because criminal proceedings are active, there are limits to what can possibly be said about the evidence. The Crown Prosecution Service has specifically warned that material which could prejudice a fair trial should not be reported or shared. What we know is that forensic post-mortem found that the 3 victims died from blunt force trauma. We know that investigators believe that deaths were murders. We know Tshuma left Britain shortly after the bodies were discovered. We know he traveled to South Africa. We know British authorities sought his arrest. And we know South African police eventually located and arrested him in Johannesburg. But the full story will ultimately have to come through the evidence presented in court. What makes this case particularly unusual is how quickly it crossed borders. A family dies in Bedfordshire, a suspect leaves Britain, and international investigation begins. Interpol becomes involved. South African authorities received alerts. A tip assists investigators locate the suspect, and within days he's arrested in Johannesburg. This is what modern fugitive investigations increasingly look like. Criminal cases don't necessarily stop at national borders. A person can board a plane, cross continents, change jurisdictions, and believe they've created distance between themselves and the investigation. But distance doesn't necessarily mean safety. In this case, the investigation followed from Britain to international law enforcement to South Africa and eventually to a courtroom in Johannesburg. On the surface, this story appears to be about a man who allegedly fled a country after 3 people died. But underneath it, there is a much bigger question. Can someone really escape a murder investigation by simply crossing a border? The answer in this case appears to be not easily. The investigation followed Tshuma from Britain, Dubai to South Africa. And once he was found, a second criminal case emerged. The firearm allegation will be dealt with in South Africa. The murder allegations, if extradition is granted, will be dealt with in Britain. And the final answers will not come from social media, they won't come from rumors, they won't come from internet detectives like me, they will come from evidence. 3 lives were lost, a mother, a teenager, and a 5-year-old child. Their families are now left waiting for answers. And somewhere between Bedfordshire, Dubai, Johannesburg, and a courtroom, the next chapter of this case is being written. Ndodana Tshuma remains in South African custody. He faces 3 murder charges authorized by British prosecutors and separate firearm and ammunition charges in South Africa. He has not been convicted of the murders, and the allegations against him must be tested through the courts. His next appearance is scheduled for 27 August 2026. That is when another chapter of this international legal battle is expected to unfold. But perhaps the most haunting question is not where did he run? It's what happened before he ran. And that is the question investigators in Britain are still trying to answer.